We are here to talk about leadership and statecraft, but you cannot craft a state without leadership, and you cannot lead people willingly, at any rate, into crafting a state unless they have a common identity and shared purpose. And one of the primary catalysts for bringing people together are myths. Whether these myths be promulgated through literary works, or through oral tradition, or through sacred texts, doesn't really matter. The end result is the same, that they instill a sense of belonging around which a community can rally. Now, to us in the room, it may seem as though myths are in opposition to history. History is, crudely put, what happened, or at least what we think happened, whereas myths are tales. But for most of human history, that has not been the case at all. In fact, myths are not historic fiction for most human societies, but simply a version of understanding our shared past. So as a classicist studying ancient Greece and Rome, I'm going to delve back, like Daisy did, into ancient Greece and Rome. Because in this period, mytho-historical tales had blurred lines. Whilst there was debate about the nature of the gods and the interaction of gods with mortals, generally speaking, there was no question about these heroic figures about whom we've just heard having existed. They did exist. They were figures of our past. And what that meant was ancient cultures could place their own civilization within the fabric of the past and find these larger-than-life characters as part of their shared inheritance. As we just heard from Daisy, that could have real-world consequences. When in the 50s BC, Julius Caesar is putting it about that Venus is a long-lost ancestor of his, well, that very much sets the frame for his being raised to an emperor-like figure on whose death deification is possible, and that sequence of divine-like emperors, of course, changes not just Rome and ancient Europe, but shapes much of our modern world. So myths can change worlds. But in what I'm saying today, I would like to turn that around and ask what happens when myths are banished from a society. What happens when reason rises supreme over all that is immaterial, all that is supernatural, and myths are dismissed as false and meaningless. And to explore that, I'm going to dive back to one of the great countercultural radicals of the ancient Greek world, Epicurus. Epicurus was a philosopher from the Greek island of Samos, who around 300 BC traveled to Athens, and he set up there an intellectual community, which, as far as I know, was the first in the world to teach men and women on equal terms. It was a micro-university for exploring and understanding the universe. And the theories that Epicurus built, of course, came to be understood as Epicureanism. That was one of the big four Hellenistic schools which emerged after the tumult of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the others being Stoicism, skepticism, and cynicism. So just to set out very briefly, because of course my time is limited, the three most controversial beliefs of Epicureanism to give you a flavour. The first is that it was fundamentally materialist. Everything that exists is either matter or void. And everything that is matter is made out of atoms. Now, to us in the room, that seems completely natural and obvious, but in the ancient world, that was a ridiculous theory. The idea that there was these indivisible but invisible particles was thought to be madness. Secondly, because everything that exists is material, we humans are simply a collection of atoms, which means when we die, the whole nature of us dies, including our soul, which is also material, so there is no afterlife. Again, very controversial in antiquity. And thirdly, although the gods do exist, they too are made out of matter, they exist outside our world, and fundamentally do not care about what we do on our planet. So there is no providence, there's no divine mission for us, and our own religion and superstition has no impact upon the gods. They are simply irrelevant to us. Well, all of those three things, immaterialism, the afterlife, and religion, are of course ongoing and effectively insoluble debates which keep us talking. So what was an Epicurean meant to do with those beliefs in the ancient world? Simply put, pursue pleasure as the ultimate good. Now, this wasn't the hedonism that we might think, a sort of sex, drugs, rock and roll, do what you like attitude. Instead, it was a much more internal and meditative kind of pleasure that the Epicureans sought. Briefly put, they thought that if you lived properly, you could avoid physical pain. And if you understood the world properly, you could lose any mental pain by virtue of understanding the world possibly. And that would be as good as things could get for you. Understanding the world perfectly and therefore having ultimate pleasure. Well, myths for Epicurus and his followers were the major obstacle against that understanding. They were irrational, illogical, and blocked your attempt to understanding the universe. So we just heard Daisy talk about how influential and quasi-biblical Homer's poems were. But for Epicurus, he would speak of the babblings of Homer. You know, this random poet spouting nonsense that needs to be rejected, just as Plato rejected him from his ideal state. So why do myths exist? What do the Epicureans say about that? To answer that question, we have to leap across to Rome, where a poet called Lucretius, whom I mention in the summary of this paper, sat down and wrote a 6-book epic poem versifying Epicurean doctrines to try and captivate and convince the skeptical Roman reader. And it's a profoundly beautiful poem, but it's also a lesson by the end of which you are meant to conclude that Epicureanism is indeed the only way to live. And in the 5th book of that work, we have an amazing account, some 500 lines, about the evolution of humankind. And in the course of that story, Lucretius is very explicit that the myths that have existed in the world are born entirely from misunderstanding. They are nonsense coming from nonsensical readings of our universe. Because let us remember, for the Epicurean, there was nothing special about humans. We weren't created by the gods. There's no plan as to where we're heading. We're simply a species that by chance is the best suited to the world we happen to live in. So there's a sort of proto-Darwinian set of ideas in Epicureanism about humans, but it removes anything special from us as individuals versus other animals. We're simply just a bit better at getting on in our world. Lucretius concedes that over time we have evolved in terms of our understanding. We've found new technologies by chance. Shipbuilding it may be, or in Engelsberg, ironworking is discussed by Lucretius, and those have helped in a sense. But Epicurus and Lucretius are very clear that all of our steps forward are also steps back. New technology creates new greed, it creates new conflict, it creates warfare, it creates suffering. So the problem is that for the Epicureans, there's no origin story of human creation. There's no goal, no teleology in human progress. And even if we do discover new things and change how we live, it's not necessarily for the good. So this is my big question. What happens to human society if it is devoid of purpose, without any shared past or any shared future within which to hope? I'll call that presentism, if I may. That term is used in different ways in different quarters. But what is the problem and the consequence of a presentist view of society? Well, fundamentally, the focus falls on the individual. It's the only thing to look towards if the past and the future have no broader bearing. And there are 2 possible effects of turning inwards as an individual. The first is to withdraw from the public sphere, from the agora in Greece, from the forum in Rome, and to turn inwards. The Greeks had a term for someone who stepped away from political life and lived alone, and that was the idiotes. And if you want a sense of how that term has played out, that gives us the word idiot. In Greek society, men, and in a male-led society, do not back away from public engagement. So one outcome is an almost private retreat, a cult-like kind of gathering, which has no interest in the broader society around it. The other, which is more sinister, is that by virtue of all individuals having no relationship to an institution or to a particular tradition, end up being flattened out into being units that are fundamentally identical. And if there's no traditional institution that can bring them together and instill any sense of purpose, it creates a space where one person or a small group at the top can impose a top-down ideology, not rooted in reality, which can very quickly corral all of those people into a totalitarian and doubtless authoritarian mode of existence. So it's a very destabilizing scenario for there to be no intermediary between the individual and the state. Both outcomes are bad, but fundamentally they're also wrong, because it is a myth, I contend, that humans can live in a mythless manner. Speaking generally, cross-culturally, anthropologists find that myths, tales about the past, are a universal. We can try to reason them away, but there's something about connecting ourselves in a continuum, be it a linear line or an ever-recurring circular line, that gives us value and meaning in our lives. These things could be cultural, they could be artistic, they could be religious. And my crucial point is that the truth of them is irrelevant for their value. Myths are an orientating principle for a community, and without them, things unravel rapidly. And just to close and prove this point, let us return to Epicurus and the fate of his school. Once he died, and he died in severe physical pain, but he's recounted as saying, "It's okay, I've got full understanding, so everything's fine." His school did continue for a while in Athens, but without any broader history or purpose in which to root themselves. It was only a matter of generations before the Epicureans venerated the dead Epicurus as what? As a god. Lucretius explicitly, in a poem that tells us the gods do not exist, so don't bother with them, explicitly says not that Epicurus was like a god, but Epicurus, deus fuit, was a god. So they invent their own superstitions by virtue of no place in a broader mythic narrative. And secondly, the result of the school was that its philosophy was dismissed as meaningless. For Greeks and for Romans, generally speaking, Epicureanism was a crank philosophy that wasn't worth your time. And even with Lucretius's poem, which changed so many things down the line, it only mattered as poetry, as art in the Roman world, not as philosophy. So Virgil, Ovid, Horace, all of these famous poets are very influenced by Lucretius's poem, but not by his ideas. So, to conclude, without myth, without tales we tell ourselves about the past, we are in a meaningless void. And without being able to look back and understand where we have come from, we, whatever our particular circumstances, have no sense as to where we are heading, and we will end up in an inwards-facing cult, much like the Epicureans, who are no longer practicing their philosophy today. I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Do we see any of Epicurus' ideas floating around in politics and society today?
The major consequence of Epicureanism has been in the sciences. Epicureanism is based upon physics. By the mid-17th century, atomism was starting to look like a viable school of thought, and that is the major legacy. There's been a major misunderstanding of the hedonism that I mentioned earlier. In English and doubtless in other European languages, an epicure is someone who likes their food and drink too much and has devolved themselves into sensual pleasure. You could say that that has some presence in modern politics. But in terms of serious ideas about political philosophy, no, because Epicureanism is explicitly anti-politics. It's withdrawal from a sense of a collective societal purpose, because fundamentally there is no purpose other than securing your own personal peace, and once you've achieved that, talking about it with fellow friends who are already on message.
But I can argue that in politics you have one side who don't believe in the myths. They're trying to give us the facts. They try to use reason to be objective. And then we have the masters of the myths Putin, Trump, Bolsonaro, and to some extent the late Silvio Berlusconi. So isn't that showing that the conflict is still alive and kicking?
There is a real conflict, but I would see those as separate poles rather than meeting in the middle. That is to say, certainly it is a major problem of the society we live in, that a hyper-rationalized attempt not just to understand humanity, but to impose an ultra-rational mode of living ends up forcing people into a mode of thought that is simply not people's experience of life. And that's what I meant about an ideology which doesn't reflect a reality having to be pushed down in a forceful manner. The alternative is to take myth that does exist, repurpose it in some nationalistic or perhaps religious context, and package and frame it in a way that unites people behind a given cause. That can be a good thing, but in recent and indeed further removed history, it's a very bad thing. But I would see that more as a weaponization and deliberate use of a myth rather than a shared myth inherently being problematic.
So the good myths are possible.
Good myths are certainly possible.
And useful.
Yes, and to just sort of fleshing that out, the best myths are communally understood and encountered at the individual level rather than one person's interpretation being cascaded down in a form of propaganda upon those who already share that mythic inheritance. It's a popular affair, not an individual top-down.
There's sports where we find the good myths today.
Interesting. That's certainly where we find the narratives of heroism and heroic failure, as England supporters know. But I'm not sure whether it would flesh out further than that.
Yeah.